In the last video, we were discussing about artificial neural networks, and we discussed that artificial neural networks vaguely mimics the process of how a brain operates, how a brain operates, and I have also showed you that if I have to draw a pictorial representation of artificial neural network, then you're gonna observe some circles in this artificial neural network's pictorial representation. Each of these circles represent artificial neuron. Each of these represent artificial neurons, and one artificial neuron is connected to the other artificial neuron by some lines. These lines are also called edges. So for example, we I have shown you that this artificial neuron over here is connected to these artificial neurons by these red lines over here, and this artificial neuron is connected to these artificial neurons using these green edges, and this whole structure is representing artificial neural network. Now in this video I want to focus on these artificial neurons over here. So let's talk about these artificial neurons. Artificial neurons are connected to other artificial neurons by these edges. By these edges. Let's say this is artificial neuron number 1 and this is artificial neuron number 2. The functioning of each artificial neuron is given by us. What defines an artificial neuron are the instructions that the artificial neuron needs to perform on the data that will be passed to this artificial neuron. So let's take an example. Let's say this artificial neuron number 1 receives some data. Now this data can be given by another artificial neuron, let's say artificial neuron number 3, or this data can be given by another computer, can be given by the computer directly, like the user actually. So let us suppose a user is sitting on the computer and he gives the artificial neuron some numbers, let's say number 1, number 2, number 3. Now these numbers will be provided or will be passed on to the artificial neuron 1, right? So let me clear some of this. So the artificial neuron number 1 receives some data from the computer, and the data is some numbers, number 1, number 2, number 3. Like I told you, what defines an artificial neuron are the instructions that the artificial neuron will follow for the given data. Let us say we have given the instruction that whenever some data comes to the artificial neuron number 1, it needs to add this data. It needs to add this data. So what happens is that artificial neuron number 1 receives the data 1, 2, 3. It's gonna add this data, and it's gonna give us the output. It's gonna give us the result. It's gonna give us the information that was recorded after performing the instructions on the given data. So therefore, what defines an artificial neuron are the instructions that it needs to follow for some data. So artificial neuron number 1 gives us the result as number 6. The result number 6 will be passed on to the artificial neuron number 2. Now, artificial neuron number 2 will be different, or can be different, or may be different. It can be the same, just like artificial neuron number 1, in the terms of the instructions that it gonna uh, follow on the result given by neuron number 1. So we can say, hey, artificial neuron number 2, whenever you're gonna receive some data, you need to square that data. You need to square that data. Therefore, we can say that the difference between artificial neurons lies in the fact that what instructions or what process they're gonna follow on the given data. Artificial neuron number 1 is different from artificial neuron number 2 because artificial neuron number 1 adds the data, whereas artificial neuron number 2 squares the data. Now we can observe that this process where some neuron receives the data, processes the data, and gives the output is something similar to how the functions are defined in mathematics. The functions in mathematics also take some data, perform some instruction on the given data, and gives us the output. So we can also say that a neuron, an artificial neuron, is actually a function. An artificial neural network, on the other hand, artificial neural network is having all of these functions connected to each other. So function number one receives the data, processes the information, gives the output to some other function number 2, right? So that is the a little and so that is the little overview of what is an artificial neuron.